all over the world. They help and support them in many different ways. And I'm going to read you just a passage here in Philippians. For it has been granted to you on behalf of Christ, not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for him. We don't see a lot of that suffering in this country yet, but in many parts of the world they do, and they have joy. Of course, Stephen was our first Christian martyr, as you all know. After Stephen, there were all of Jesus' apostles except John, who was exiled. And that's gone on from then right up until today. In the arenas in Rome and other areas, and there were countless Christians that were martyred for sport and to drive the Christians down, and a lot of them underground. And the gospel spread out from there. It's a joy and a privilege for us to be here this morning to worship. We're not afraid of the church being firebombed. We're not afraid of the pastor being dragged off on false charges to prison, but that happens in many, many places. And we aren't aware of it here in this country because we have such freedom. You know, I think sometimes when you see the Olympics, you see all these countries marching in with their flags. They're so proud of their countries, and yet behind the scenes, many of them are killing and abusing Christians in many ways. They tear families apart. They imprison them. They kill them. And some of these places where they will attack, they will rape the women. They will kidnap the teenage women and take them off, force them to marry a Muslim man and to renounce their faith. They'll take the young men, the young boys, and take them to be soldiers, and they'll kill the men. That's how they operate in many places. So we can meet and freely here. But in other countries, they have to worship underground. They'll worship in sheds on their own. They're left to survive. The neighbors aren't allowed to help them. They're not allowed to work, to get a job. And this is where the voice of the martyrs come in. They will come in and supply financial help, medical help, food, education, even we have supplied and fitted them with a prosthesis. So they don't only work by themselves, they work with other Christian organizations as well. But those are some of the things that they do. Yeah. There are many groups, different groups that are trying to wipe out Christianity. You've got the communists, the Baha'i, the Muslims and Hindus, all trying to wipe out Christianity. We don't realize that here. We don't see it here because we're so free and we aren't told in the news about those things. But it happens every day in many, many countries. In Nigeria, you've heard about Nigeria on the news, I'm sure. Last year, between January and June, there were over 6,000 Christians that were killed. They burnt churches with people in them, full of people. There was over 201 churches that got burned. They burned families in their homes, and they just plain executed many of them. Now, in China, in their underground churches, they're growing, they're thriving, and yet they are persecuted as well. If they're caught, the men are taken off to prison. Some of them, believe it or not, are used for their organs. That's pretty gruesome, but it happens. And yet the Chinese church underground is growing because the young people there are so disenchanted with communism that they're turning to Christ. And when one underground church is found out, some young people will go and start another one somewhere else. So they're really doing well in that way. On the back out here, I have some maps of the areas that are being persecuted. I have some prayer cards I'd love you to pick up to pray for our brothers and sisters. You know, we're obligated to pray for them. And we forget so often when we're living here, but they need our prayers. I'm going to read one of the prayer cards to you. I have lots of these at the back and over here. Help yourselves. Felicia John was in her 20s when she sustained serious burns on her arms and legs as a result of an Islamic attack on her school. Felicia was at the College of Business and Management in Borno State when Boko Haram militants attacked the school's female dormitory. They separated Muslims from Christians before allowing the Muslims to leave. As Felicia and the other Christian women prayed, they were set on fire inside the dormitory. Pray for Felicia as she continues to recover from her burns. That's just one of hundreds. I'm not here looking for money. You don't have to think that I am. I'm not. Set your mind at ease there. But I am looking for your prayers. Our Christian brothers and sisters, we are responsible to pray for them. Wait till I find it here. Hebrews 13:3. There we are. Continue to remember those in prison as if you were together with them in prison, and those who are mistreated as if you yourselves were suffering. That's what we're to do. Pray for them as if we ourselves are there. These are our Christian brothers and sisters, and it's our obligation to pray for them. So I encourage you to pick up some material out here, prayer cards, and I have a lot of other things for you to look at. So I appreciate it if you drop by and look at it. Thank you.
So after we close the service here, Neil will go out where the coffee area is there. He's got some things set up, and just take some time to go and speak to him in person, ask any questions that you might have, or pick up some material. And I think that would be helpful ultimately, just to be informed, because sometimes we do have so many things that engage us in different ways in our lives. We forget that there's another whole world out there. And some of that world is in desperate need of our prayers. It's interesting, too, that while I didn't plan it this way, I felt like the message I needed to share this morning was on compassion. And really, that's what those kinds of needs draw on for us. If we're going to respond, we need to have compassion for others. And a lot of times, it's hard to have compassion if we're not aware that there's a need. For those who became followers of Christ as adults, I'm not talking necessarily to those raised in a Christian family, because it's a little different experience for them, but those that came to Christ as an adult, they lived a part of their life without Christ. Most testimonies I've heard mention being drawn by the loving, caring, compassionate actions and attitudes of believers, whether that came through friends or family or neighbors or even strangers that came across their path. And so Paul writes concerning what he believed to be the appropriate response. I'm going to turn to Philippians chapter 2. Philippians chapter 2, and I'm going to read verses 1 and 2 and then verse 5. If you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, if any comfort from his love, if any fellowship with the Spirit, if any tenderness and compassion, then make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and purpose. And verse 5, he said, your attitude should be the same as that of Jesus Christ. And there's a whole teaching on that next portion, but it goes on essentially to say that Christ gave up his high position and privilege, more than we could even imagine. I mean, we think of kings and billionaires as being pretty high position, but to think of the God of the universe, where money is so beyond the scope that doesn't mean anything, and power is so unlimited that we can't even imagine it. And he gave all of that up and came to suffer for our sakes. And Paul was encouraging themselves, you have the example of Christ. He had everything, but he chose to set it aside to come in and walk among us walk through the dirty little streets of the towns and villages, be hungry at times, have no place to lay his head. He had no home, and ultimately he gave his life. Paul also addressed how that our new life with Christ differs from our old life without Christ. Colossians chapter 3. Starting in the latter part of verse 9 and reading on down to verse 12. Since you have taken off your old self, that is, since you have come away from your old life, which was a life that wasn't centered on Christ or his teachings, but centered on basically whatever the culture and your world around you taught you to want and your own needs. Since you have taken off your old self with its practices and have put on the new self, that is, become a follower of Christ, which is being renewed in knowledge and in the image of its creator. Here there is no Greek or Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave, or free. There is no prejudice in this world. We talk about how that we've come so far that we're inclusive of all kinds of groups and cultures and nations and everything, as if it were a new thing. It was there 2,000 years ago and being taught. Now, the church hasn't always embraced it as well as it should have, and prejudices and all kinds of things have been there, but the teaching was that when you're in Christ, it doesn't matter who the other person is as far as where they came from. But Christ is all and is in all. Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. And so Paul was saying, we have that example. He said that in Philippians in his letter. But he said, having put off that old way of doing things and wanting to embrace Christ's way of doing things, he said, at that point, you're being changed. And it's a process. It doesn't happen instantly. There is a change that happens. I saw a dramatic change the day I gave my life over to Christ, but I wasn't a finished product. Neither am I a finished product yet. And there's some ebb and flow to that process. But where we're moving towards at the best is to clothe yourself with compassion, kindness, humility. And that is something that we do intentionally. When it talks about clothing yourself, see, you could do like the little ones do sometimes when they escape naked and they just go on a run. And it's quite cute when they're 2 years old. Not so much when you're adults. It's kind of odd. Though it was a thing there back in the 70s or wherever that was. But we intentionally clothe ourselves. And some people spend great deals of money and time and attention in clothing themselves, down to the very little bits of paint around the eyes and all the stuff that we do to look good. If we are going to present Christ, we need to clothe ourselves with the attitudes and the compassion of Christ. So while this is a large and all-encompassing topic, I'd like to look at just that one aspect of it. Clothe yourselves with compassion. Let's just sort of narrow the focus there for a little bit. I thought it was probably at least functionally defined in Philippians chapter 2 and verse 4. We didn't read that when we were reading from there, but going back to verse 4, which was between the verses we read, Philippians 2 and 4 says, each of you should look not only to your own interests, but also to the interests of others. And that, in a nutshell, is how compassion functions. It's where we stop caring as much about only our own interests. It doesn't say don't take care of your own interests, but it says we need to do more than that. And we need to look to the interest of others, whether that's others in our immediate sphere or others in other parts of the world where the need is so outstripping the capacity to meet the need that they need our help. But compassion teaches us to go beyond our own needs and look at the needs of others. The word, which in the NIV turns or comes out tenderness and compassion. That's Philippians 2 and verse 2, just at the end there. Or sorry, at the end of verse 1. If there's any tenderness and compassions, I think the King James says bowels and mercies. Now, I can understand why they changed it from bowels and mercies to tenderness and compassion, because if I say, you got to have some bowels, like, what does that mean? It doesn't mean what it used to mean. And so I looked up the word to say, why did they choose that word? And the word bowels in the Greek culture, they felt like that, which is your innermost parts. It just speaks to your where your bowels are, your guts. There's lots of different words we use for that part of the body. But in the Greek culture, it was the seat of the stronger, more violent emotions. But in the Hebrew culture, it was the seat of tender affection. And so tender mercies is probably a better way, at least in our modern English, to describe that. Compassion is that inner and at times hurting and even groaning feeling which evokes a strong and at times, again, even a violent emotional push to act on it. Compassion is that feeling in here that is so strong that it overwhelms us with the need to act on it. It pushes us to act. And I believe every great work or significant work for God that has been done throughout the certainly the lifetime of the church in the past 2,000 years, if you study those and we only have a handful really compared to all that's been done. There's a ton of Christian work that is done that is never reported and never heard of. But for the ones that we do know, every great work has this behind it, pushing people to act and go outside of their comfort zones, as we say in North America, because North America in its entirety is a comfort zone. And we are taught to work towards comfort. And Christ gives the opposite message. He said, you need to step out of your comfort and go and do something for somebody else. Jesus had compassion, and he modeled it. He had compassion for the crowds. I'll just look at a couple of verses that talk about when Jesus had compassion on the multitudes or the crowds. Matthew chapter 9 and verse 36. When he, that is Jesus, when he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. He saw their state, and he saw beyond just the fact that there was a crowd there. He saw what was going on the inside, because God does that. He can have that sight that goes beyond what we see. And he had compassion. He saw them in trouble and had compassion. Matthew 14 and verse 14. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. And so he saw the crowd in this instance, and he saw them with a lot of illness and sickness because they brought the sick people wherever they heard Jesus was going to be after a while. And it would be the same today. If there was a place or a person through whom healing was freely given, and people would come to that person or to that place where that person maybe was or those people were, and cancer was gone, and limbs were restored, and eyes were opened, and ears were opened, and all kinds of diseases, do you think there would be people coming there? I think there would. And it has happened in smaller pockets here and there. I don't know if that's the whole message, but it certainly is part of the message. Jesus, when he saw the crowd, he had compassion and he released healing. Because ultimately, even if God works through a person or a group of people to manifest those kinds of supernatural provisions, it is still God doing the work. It is still Jesus from heaven on his throne saying, I have compassion on those people. And we sometimes get distracted by the person or people through whom those miracles go. But God is there. He still has compassion on the crowds. The last one in this category is chapter 15, verse 32. Jesus called his disciples and said to him and said, I have compassion for these people. They have already been with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. Can you imagine staying in church for 3 days, not even breaking for lunch? I mean, we have conferences, and the cry is always less teaching, more food, more breaks, more whatever. And he says, I do not want to send them away hungry, or they may collapse on the way. He had compassion for them because they were hungry. And so God takes care of all the different areas of our need. Jesus also had compassion on individuals. Matthew chapter 20, verse 34. There were 2 blind men along the side of the road. And Jesus had compassion on them. This is verse 34 of chapter 20. And touched their eyes. Immediately they received their sight and followed him. So it doesn't have to be just a big crowd of people that have needs, because some people will say, well, if we can get a big enough crowd together, God will move. God will move on the individual. And then there was a man with leprosy, Mark chapter 1, verse 41. Filled with compassion, Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. Now, touching a person with leprosy, you're touching somebody that's contaminated with a disease that's communicable. And I don't know if we always pay attention to that, but Jesus was not afraid to go and touch the leper. He reached his hand out and touched the man. I am willing, he said, be clean, because the man had asked for healing. And so he was cleansed of that horrible disease known as leprosy. Again, it's something we don't know much about in this part of the world. I suppose it's the closest I can think of that we'd be aware of is flesh-eating disease or cancer. Those are other diseases that are very devastating, but the man with leprosy was healed. And then the last one is the widow in Nain. It's found in Luke chapter 7. Verses 13 to 15. This is something I would love for God to have me do, but I'd be terrified to do it, is interrupt a funeral procession and bring the person back to life. I don't think Mackies would be happy with me, but maybe they would, because they get to do it again. See, they've already got their money and they get to get it again later on. When the Lord saw her, this is a woman who is a widow, so she has no husband, and she has just lost her only son. They're having the funeral for her only son. When the Lord saw her, his heart went out to her. And he said, don't cry. Then he went up and touched the coffin, and those carrying it stood still. He said, young man, I say to you, get up. And the dead man sat up and began to talk, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. That's the depths of compassion that Christ has and demonstrated while he was on earth. Jesus modeled it, and he teaches us to have compassion and act on it. You can have compassion and not act on it. I don't know what that is. I guess that would be sympathy. Sympathy is where you feel bad, but you don't really do anything. And compassion or empathy is you feel bad, but you have a push to do something. Now, I know there's situations where there's not as much that we can physically do, but we want to do something. It's a human emotion, and it's part of how we were designed. God designed us. It wasn't like he's teaching us to do something that we weren't already designed to do. 2 Corinthians chapter 1. Verses 3 and 4. Praise be to God, the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion, the one who created compassion in the beginning, and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in our troubles, so that we can comfort those who are in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves receive from God. So when we're asked to be compassionate and comfort others, God first was compassionate with us, and we have that model then to bring to others. He's not asking us to do something that he's not willing to do for us. But it is a human emotion, sometimes called empathy, feeling what we perceive to be what another is feeling, and often experience something sad and doing, they just do it. And there's other people that can do it, can choose or not choose. And then there's some people that seem to be like very cold and they just don't really care. And I don't want to talk about the whole process of how that happens, but I believe there are more factors at play than just being born that way. But there is an element. There's a story that I wanted to share, true story, that was written up in a collection of stories. There's a little boy appeared under the store owner's sign that said puppies for sale. How much are you going to sell the puppies for? He asked. The store owner replied, well, anywhere from $30 to $50. I have $2.37, the little boy said. Can I please look at them? The store owner smiled and whistled, and out of the kennel came 5 teeny tiny balls of fur. One puppy was lagging considerably behind. Immediately, the little boy singled out the lagging, limping puppy and said, what's wrong with that little dog? The owner explained that it had no hip socket and it would always be lame. The little boy excitedly exclaimed, that is the puppy I want to buy. The store owner said, well, no, you don't want to buy that little dog. If you really want him, I'll just give him to you. The little boy got very upset. He looked straight into the store owner's eyes, pointed his finger and said, I don't want you to give him to me. That little dog is worth every bit as much as all the other dogs. I will pay the full price. In fact, I will give you my $2.37 right now, and I will give you 50 cents a month until I have him paid for in full. Then the store owner said, well, you don't really want to buy this little dog. He is never going to be able to run and jump and play with you like the other puppies. To this, the little boy reached down, rolled up his pant leg to reveal a badly twisted and crippled left leg, supported by a big metal brace. He looked up the store owner and replied, well, I don't run so well myself. And that little puppy will need somebody who understands. And I know this is about a little boy and his dog, but sometimes when we've been someplace and we know it's been a hard place, and God helps us to get past those hardships. Maybe he does it through the kind, caring acts of others. Maybe he sovereignly supplies the need. It gives us a point of reference when somebody else is in trouble. What happens, though, when we give and give and give to help others over a long period? Doesn't always happen, but it can happen if you're not careful. You can lose that passion. And maybe some of you have experienced that in small ways and sometimes in larger ways. Well, when we lose passion from our compassion, we become hardened, sometimes even numb to the plight of others, even irritated by their neediness. Well, I wish they'd just straighten up and fix their own problems and keep coming to me. That tiredness affects not just our ability to do for others, but it affects our own personal lives. It mimics, in a lot of ways, what they call depression, because we become very unhappy. We are happiest when we are doing for others, because it gives us back an intangible something. And I believe that is also a God design, that energizes us and makes us feel better about our life and who we are. But it's not depression in this case. About 25 to 30 years ago, it was identified as something that they now call compassion fatigue. It was first identified and looked at in frontline workers such as police, fire, EMS, nursing, those areas where people are in, by their profession, in the path of people with great needs and sometimes very traumatic incidents that create needs. And when they're exposed to that over and over again, they become numb and they just can't feel anymore. They start out with because people that go into those kinds of professions generally go into them for all the right reasons, because they care about other people and they want to be helpful. And then after a while, it affects them and affects their ability to be effective even in their jobs. But later it was discovered that it could show up in anyone who was a caregiver for an extended period of time. And they begin to note that especially with people in our modern society that have to be caregivers because our health system doesn't provide all the help that's needed in certain situations. And so people caring for elderly parents, people caring for others that have illnesses that are debilitating. One lady I remember talking to one time, she had two daughters. They both had such severe physical issues that she was a caregiver for them all of her life. They never walked, so she had to carry them everywhere. And they lived to be, the one died about 35, the other lived to be about 40 something. And she died. And I was speaking to her after the death of the second daughter because she was having a hard time because she was just lost, because her whole world was built around caregiving. It was all she ever did, day and night. And now she was just, I don't even know who I am. So we looked at how to sort that out. But that kind of caring, and it doesn't have to be even at that level, but it can wear on us. It can take away our natural compassion and make us feel like we just can't do this anymore. And we become angry at the very people we're caring for, whether that is a child, a spouse, a parent, a grandparent, or a group of people, depending on your situation. What was God thinking? Asking us to be compassionate and caring of others, knowing that it would do this to us. Well, there's good news. While this is a difficult situation to deal with and difficult to correct, it is not impossible. Once they identified it, then they began to identify ways to correct the situation if it becomes something that's affecting our personal lives. Now, the psychologists, they are only looking at sort of the human part of this equation, the emotions, the thoughts, the physical reactions. But they developed three main strategies to deal with what they would call compassion fatigue. And in those categories or whatever, you would find a variety of methods and ways to get at each of them. But essentially, there's three things that they look to that need to change if a person has gotten to the place where they've got compassion fatigue. Because I've seen it in the church as a whole, I've seen it in the church in individuals. One thing that they suggest is to join a supportive peer group. And they found that getting together with groups of other people that have similar challenges, and they can kind of talk about it, you don't feel so alone in your struggle, and that is very helpful. Secondly, regular intervals of separation from your work, whatever that may be. So they said you need to take regular breaks at specific intervals. You have to be intentional about stepping away or unplugging, if you will, from the work, whatever work it is that you're doing that is making it difficult. And the third one is refresh yourself on the inside. Attend to your inner need or to your self-care. And that happens in a lot of different ways. But that's what they recommend. If you can attend to those three main areas in a way that works for you, you can begin to recover your energy and your passion. And you're good at that. Join supportive peer groups. Other people that want to do the same kind of work, but are also feeling distressed, and they don't want to feel like they're the only one doing it. And so God encouraged us to join together in these communities of faith, which we call churches. I know they're not always great, just like not every family is great, but you got to find one that works for you and try to stick it out. I've got family members that I just absolutely love it when they show up at my door, and others that I say, oh, isn't that interesting? Cousin Sally is here. And we still open the door, but I just think Cousin Sally is here. And we still open the door, but I don't have a Cousin Sally. But if I did, She would be the interesting one. When she shows up. Regular intervals of separating from the work that we do. Does that sound like Sabbath? Isn't that the same concept? You work 6 days, you take a day and step away from the work. And in the Jewish tradition, that was a day of worship, and in the Christian tradition, it was shifted a little bit because it became a day of celebratory time to celebrate all the things God had done in the 6 days when they were out witnessing and working and doing work for God, and then they had a celebratory day. I love that concept. I think somebody picked it up when they were doing cell group type of church, and they called it Cell and Celebrate. So for 6 days, you did your work, whatever that was, your ministry, and they celebrate. So that idea that work 7 days a week and never get to church and never separate from their work, whether that is Christian work or a mix of Christian and secular, which is the case for a lot of people, it never goes well because you'll burn out. You'll get compassion fatigue and you won't do anything well. And refresh yourself on the inside. Attend to your inner needs or your self-care. Sounds a lot like prayer and personal devotion. We need to look inside once in a while and say, God, we got a mess here. We got to clean up. Or maybe we don't. Maybe we just, I'm here. And I just want you to come in to my personal space and tell me about life, about you, about the things that will lift me up. And so while we do it as a group, we obviously have to find times of rest, and that a change of reading, it really is different for every person. It can be sitting there in a quiet space and lighting candles. I don't know what that does for people, but it does. It's whatever works for you. So stepping back and taking those breaks. We found that when we were going through a particularly difficult time where there's just a lot of demands on Pam and I, and that's it for the year, we decided we were going to take a couple of days here, a couple of days here, a couple of days here, and that worked way better. And God encouraged us to do that. He said, take more shorter breaks. Surprise, surprise. It's been there for thousands of years, but he had to reteach us. And then refresh yourself. Take that time to take inventory between you and God in a time of prayer. It can be at us where you're worshiping, can be even in church when you're worshiping, when you kind of just close yourself in with God. But on a daily basis, it's helpful to have even 10 minutes just to draw away and say, God, I need to check in. How am I doing? Again, Paul wrote, and this is the last verse for this morning, Galatians chapter 6 and verse 9. Because he knew, like others, what it was like to go long hours and get tired. Galatians 6 and 9. It's probably up on the board there by now. Let us not become weary in well-doing, or in doing good. For at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. At times you may feel weary in well-doing, and Satan will step into that space and say, just give it up. You're kind of useless at this anyway. You can't even do that right. But don't give up. If you're tired, there's things you can do to replenish your energies. But don't give up. Take care of yourself as needed so that you can continue to care for others. If you have no other reason, because sometimes people despair of their situation so much that they stop even caring about themselves. If for no other reason that you can find, but that you would be available to care for others. I have had moments like that in my life where I felt like I was such a loser, if you want to say it that way, that I wasn't even worth the time and trouble. But I said, God, in case I might be able to help somebody else, can you help me? And he heard that prayer and he answered. Now, he might have had a different opinion, but at that moment, it was about helping me find a place to plug in, a reason to plug in and be re-energized. Let's pray. Father, we thank you today that you love us and that you had such compassion that you came down and for a little while you walked among us and you displayed to us to energize us and to encourage us and to empower us. And Lord, I pray that you would give us the compassion that we need to care for others and to empower us. And Lord, I pray that you would give us the compassion that we need to care for others. But Lord, also give us the wisdom to. Amen. Amen. So we're going to go just in the other room. If you have a chance to grab a coffee and have a chat.